Hi, everybody. I'm Gary Brand. I'm the Executive Director of ETOM. Welcome to our first fall 2023 virtual workshop, where our topic is the 3 E's of teaching with AI: ethics, equity, and empowerment. I also have this long bio intro for Flower Darby, our presenter, and she said, skip that and tell a personal story. This is all I could come up with. I first saw her AI presentation at GRCC, and afterwards I said, wow, she was great. She's wonderful. And my new boss, Amy Lynn, said, she's not only wonderful at what she does, but she is a wonderful person. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Flower.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for bringing me into this group. The only thing that I do is try to apply the challenges that we're all facing to my own experience. And so just a little tiny bit about me professionally. I am an associate director in the University of Missouri's Teaching for Learning Center. I have been teaching college and university classes for 28 years, in person, online, in the dance studio, because I teach things like English and educational technology and dance and Pilates. And so I really have a range of interests, and I have a couple of books out on that I've been able to co-author on effective teaching, online, using technology. And this ChatGPT and generative AI thing has really hit higher ed like a bus. I mean, there is just a lot that we need to wrap our heads around. So I'm here today to talk to us, and spoiler alert, I'm going to give you my argument right now. I do believe that even though we probably have concerns, hesitations, we may even be feeling anxiety and fear, and maybe some of us are here as well feeling excited and enthusiastic about what we can do with generative AI, generative artificial intelligence. I do believe we need to incorporate it into our teaching and into our classes. Now, I'm also going to recognize that many of us are at different points of that acceptance journey. And so maybe many of us have objections today. That is absolutely understandable. And we're going to talk more about all of those things as we proceed. Just a little housekeeping moment. I'm going to save time for questions and conversation at the end of our time together. Do feel free to use the chat box to interact with each other, because you all have lots of good ideas, strategies, resources, things that you have been doing. However, I make a deliberate effort to keep my eyes on the camera when I'm not asking you a specific question. And the reason is that is a pedagogical design that I use called immediacy cues. It comes from communication science. And this is a nonverbal way of reducing the distance between us and of communicating to you that I am approachable and available. So I would encourage you to do something like this if and when you're teaching to the camera as well, whether it's recorded or a synchronous event such as today. So it is a skill that you can practice, but what this means, I'm not watching the chat, except occasionally I will stop and ask you a question, and then I'll turn my eyes to the chat and see what we're doing in there. Otherwise, engage with each other, post any questions. Gary has kindly agreed to capture those and bring them forward at the end of our time together. Now, who am I when I'm not in my Zoom box, when I'm not teaching and learning and working? Well, I have a wonderful family. I have a strong partner and collaborator in my work in my husband. He has been doing IT and online course support for faculty at the university level for 30 years. And so much of what I bring to you comes from his experience and wisdom as well. We have 3 teenage daughters, which is super fun, as you can imagine. And we love to travel as a family. Here are a few pictures from last year's trip to London, which was our first opportunity after lockdown to really get out and play as a family. Now, why have I taken a precious moment here to talk a little bit about who I am when I'm not working? It's because it's actually a key strategy that applies in every teaching and learning context. Today, we're going to touch on helping our students do their work with integrity. Well, one of the things that we can help our students choose that path of integrity is to help them feel connected with us as real people. So this is a quick point. I'm not going to camp on this, but I would say helping your students see who you are as a person outside of class, outside of Canvas, or wherever you teach online, outside of D2L or Blackboard. It helps students feel that connection. That's actually going to help them resist the temptation to cheat. So not that you necessarily have to divulge as much as I have here. Maybe you don't want to show the pictures of family faces. Maybe you prefer to share an image or a little, an image of a pet or a hobby. maybe a meme, or maybe you use emojis. Anything that kind of personalizes you and humanizes you will help your students choose integrity when they face temptations to cut corners, which is an increasingly prevalent temptation with the advent of ChatGPT and other generative AI. So I encourage you to help your students see you as a person, but let's move on because we have a lot to talk about here today. And I would love to see where you are and how you're feeling about this challenge that we're facing. If you would like to do so, always an invitation, never an obligation. Would you put a word into the chat box that shows how you feel about teaching in an AI age? It's helpful to me to take a pulse. Where are we? How are we feeling? What's on your mind? Alarmed. Thank you. Appreciate that. Michelle, to get us started. Pumped. Okay. Nervous. Interested. Excited. Overwhelmed. Hesitant. Okay. Let's see. What else? Hopeful. Anxious. Uncertain. Unsure. Uneasy. Unfamiliar. Interesting. Impersonal. Curious. Skeptical. Okay. Excited. Yesterday, I asked this question to a faculty group and I got a few answers like horrified and fearful and terrified. So you're generally looking like a little bit more of an optimistic and curious group. I appreciate that. Undecided. Hypocritical. Okay, interesting. I'm wondering if we're finding ways to use these tools and we're aware that we can help our students find ways to use these tools as well. Intrigued. Yes. So here's where I'm going with this. First of all, again, it's really helpful for me to see where we are as a group because I'm seeing this shift slowly, literally day by day and week by week. I was giving talks like these. For example, the one that Gary attended was earlier in August. And since that time, even in the last number of weeks, I've seen more curiosity, more willingness to accept that this is here and we need to incorporate it. And this is the argument I'm going to make as well today. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and inputs. I don't know about you, but I have felt all of those things at any given day since ChatGPT burst on the scene in November 22. Now, we are talking today about generative AI, and the sort of the standard generic one that many people are using is ChatGPT. And so I use it, I don't mean it's a generic tool, but I use that term or that name kind of like we say we're going to Google something or I need a Kleenex. So if I say ChatGPT, kind of expand that to mean all these generative AI forms, which I will also just say GenAI as well. But here's the point. We have all felt these differing emotions, these experiences, and I still do day to day, even though I've been really engaged in this work for several months now, I still feel cautious, terrified sometimes, anxious, intrigued, optimistic, and we're going to recognize that the way that we feel has a strong impact on our own motivation to engage in the task ahead of us, which is, I'm going to argue, to figure out how to teach effectively with AI. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to walk out of this hour feeling like we have all the bells and whistles and all the skills, because as I will mention in a minute, I do believe we're on kind of a spectrum, a continuum of comfort levels and experience, and that's okay. That's why we're here today. But recognize that if we are feeling empowered in this moment, we're going to feel more energized to tackle this challenge. And if we are feeling shut down, frustrated, downright angry, I think that's a fair response as well. It's going to be hard to generate that motivation. And again, it's just important to recognize that, but also to think about how that works for our students. If our students are feeling energized, empowered, confident, optimistic, they will be more likely to dig in and do the work that we're asking them to do with integrity and in a meaningful way. If our students are feeling shut down, frustrated, overwhelmed, anxious about the work that we're asking them to do, it will be more tempting for them to resort to ChatGPT or other forms of cheating. So just an important point to recognize that our emotions really do impact our motivation, also our ability to think clearly and deeply about what we're engaging with. So I don't know about you, as I mentioned, I do believe that we have lots of people, a lot of different places along the continuum of I'm all in and I have my head in the sand. Well, I spent much of the spring semester 2023 with my head firmly in the sand. I just couldn't. What is this? What does this mean? New headlines were coming out every day about the end of the college essay and ChatGPT can pass the LSAT and all these scary headlines. And then there were some that students were writing about. You have no idea how much we're cheating. It was like, I just couldn't in the spring. However, I also began to see, because I knew we needed to start to figure out. So I was way over here head in the sand, but I started attending some presentations, and there were some people way over here that were so enthusiastic. You can do this and that, and wow, look. I found that really overwhelming, and that shut me down. Like, I'm not going to be this person over here who's all in on all the tech and all the bells and whistles. That was overwhelming to me. So for me, it was important to start to find my way to a middle ground. And a turning point in my journey in coming to terms with teaching in an AI age was a keynote talk that was delivered by Vint Cerf. He is considered to be one of the founders of the internet and currently chief internet evangelist of Google. I attended his talk in early May, and it shifted my thinking. He made the point, he made the analogy that the advent of Gen AI is like when the internet dawned and when the smartphone dawned. I actually made a similar point to a group of undergrads yesterday, and I was like, I bet you in here don't remember the birth of the internet, but I'm guessing that many of us here do remember a time before the internet. And as I thought more about his words, I got to thinking about my experience as an undergraduate student. When I had a research paper due, I would go to the physical library, look up relevant articles using the card catalog, find them on microfiche or microfilm, feed them into the machine, scan the article, find out that it wasn't actually a super relevant article, and then start all over again. Now, again, maybe some of us here don't have that experience, but maybe some of us do. And so it just really got me thinking about how much technology has changed the way we do things. And often there are positive impacts. The internet and a smartphone, there are dangers, there are downsides, there are concerns. I do understand that. But it really has made lots and lots of things more efficient. We can do our scholarly research more efficiently. We can manage all kinds of day-to-day routines and tasks in ways that just really save us a lot of time. However, I do think it's really important to recognize that this kind of technological development literally changes the way we do things. So if we are going to keep our heads in the sand, we are not going to be supporting the needs of today's students. So I don't pretend to have all the technical details about large learning language models. In fact, I just said that wrong, large language models. I'm not a tech computer scientist, but I am a faculty member who's in the trenches trying to figure out what we can do. And so together, I'm going to invite us to co-create our way forward as we consider what this means for us as educators who care deeply about our students' learning and their authentic learning, because we are issuing credentials, whether it's the final grade in a course we teach, whether it is a certificate or a credential in our college or a degree. Those indicate that the students know what they need to know. And so we want to think about authentically helping them learn that as well. So for me, as we think about beginning to incorporate AI, maybe some of you are already using it, in which case, please post your ideas in the chat box, what you're doing. For me, it came down to these 3 E's, and these are big considerations. And I'm going to sort of touch on them briefly because I want to have plenty of time to talk about, okay, if you're with me, if you're open to the idea that if you aren't already, we should be starting to think about using AI in our classes, I want to leave time for some of the strategies and the conversation at the end. So the 3 E's, as was mentioned in the title, the first one is ethics. Now, again, these are all really big considerations, could probably talk for an entire hour about all of these. But I want to acknowledge that there are legitimate and valid ethical concerns to the way these tools were developed and the output that they provide, and perhaps even students' willingness to engage with them. So there's a few different things I'm thinking about here. First of all, we know that there was a human labor cost in the training of ChatGPT 3, that workers in the global south were exploited and subjected actually to trauma as they trained the models. They were forced to look at all kinds of things from the internet, which are unsavory, despicable, disgusting, because that's how the tool was trained, is by scrubbing the entire internet. And we know there's lots out there that is dark, that is devious. And so there is a human labor cost in the development of ChatGPT. And I would say ongoing, there's going to be these costs. There's also an environmental cost. Many people would argue that this, any kind of technology actually takes a toll on the environment with increased greenhouse gases and fossil fuels and use of limited resources. And so I think it's important to recognize. We also know that there are hidden biases that come out in ChatGPT and other tools because these tools were trained and are in, ongoing trained on what's out there in the internet. So what they find out there is what they're going to bring forward. And a simple example would be if you were to ask the image generator such as Dolly, and many people have probably seen this, but just in case you haven't, if you were to ask Dolly to provide an image of a pilot and a flight attendant, well, the pilot is male and the flight attendant is female. If you were to ask the image generator to create an image of a science professor, a chemistry professor, oftentimes it's a white male. And if you were to look at something, for example, provide an image of a custodian, oftentimes it's going to be a person of color. So it really is reflecting the biases that exist in our society, in our world, and that are reflected online. So those are some pretty major ethical concerns. And yet, despite those flaws, despite those challenges, I think we need to be thinking about how to use these from an informed and critical perspective, recognizing the flaws of the tools as they exist right now. How do we use them in an ethical way, and how do we use them? How do we help our students use them in an ethical and appropriate and responsible way? Because I believe they're going to need to know how to do so. Now, equity is another concern that we have here. And again, multiple facets to this particular topic, but long story short, let me cut right to the chase. I believe if we're not helping our students learn to use these tools effectively, appropriately, responsibly, then we are enacting an inequity. It is already the case. This was coming out in the summer during, there was a lot of media coverage, both higher ed focused and just in general. And I read a piece early in the summer, another one of those turning points. And one of the people who were interviewed in the article said, it's a matter of the rich are getting richer. If there are people or students, for example, who already have good access to internet and technology and infrastructure, they are already at an advantage. And as they begin to use these tools, they're going to be at more of an advantage. If we have students who have had less access, less opportunity to develop tech skills, access to internet, these kinds of things, or if our students are coming to us from high schools or other colleges, or if our college is banning the use of ChatGPT, and I understand whole countries are banning the use of ChatGPT right now because it's a scary, dangerous thing. Those people, those students are going to be at a disadvantage. And this is going to impact them not only as students, but in today's job market. So we're going to talk more about this later. I do believe that if we're not helping students learn to use these tools, then we're not helping our students be the most competitive job seekers they can be, and really engaged citizens. It's not only about work. So I do believe we have an equity call to help our students learn how to use these tools well and to develop fluency. So that is where I land on empowerment. It is about helping ourselves know how to use these tools well so that we can help our students know how to use these tools well. And a little bit later in the talk, I'm going to share some insights that I received by attending lots of webinars, right? I've been listening to all the not all of them, but I've been doing a lot of research, a lot of focus on this since I finally got my head out of the sand. And I do believe we have an opportunity, and an important one, to empower our students so that they can use these tools with a critical ethical awareness and to be competitive in whatever it is that they're pursuing at work or in their personal and civic lives. But that doesn't mean that we don't have some problems to deal with here. We do have some really uncomfortable truths. I don't believe that these tools, the answers that we have today, let me put it that way, I don't think it's going to mean that students aren't going to cheat or plagiarize. I do believe that we don't have a crystal ball right now. Nobody does. I've been paying attention to the leading thinkers, speakers. There's research coming out every day, every week on how students are using these tools, how faculty are using these tools, what's happening in academia, what's happening more broadly, thinking about how this works in research and scholarship. And as of today, we don't know how these things are going to go. We don't know what the easy answers are. There aren't any easy answers. But we also know that it makes it increasingly not challenging, it makes it increasingly easy and tempting for students to cut corners. But here's these insights that I was just referring to. A few weeks ago, I attended a webinar by AQ, it's the Association of College and University Educators. And I know that's not a clickable link right there, but you may want to jot this down, or at least jot down enough that you could Google it, because this webinar is freely available for you to watch as well. And it featured these two leading thinkers in higher education, but also very interestingly to me, this top executive in HR with the US office of, or North American office of Porsche. And they said a couple of really interesting things that persuaded me that, yeah, we really need to get on board with this challenging situation. And so I'm going to share these two talking points that these panelists raised, just in case some of us here are still kind of thinking, yeah, I don't know how this is going to, thank you, Carl, appreciate that, how this is going to impact our students. They said two things. They said, first of all, the very thing that we are asking, the things we're worried about our students using AI for, the things that we want to police them and ban them from doing, those are the things that are going to get them jobs. Like, whoa. I talked with a professor friend of mine in June. His daughter works at a large retailing company, and she had to fire, she works, by the way, in like the marketing and copy editing area of that company. She had to fire 3 employees because ChatGPT could do their jobs better than they could. And so it is in the workplace right now. This Dr. Burke was talking about how they are using it in HR for job descriptions, interview questions, all kinds of things that is saving them time. And they also have other rules, right? Like you can't have proprietary information. You can't put that into ChatGPT. So a really interesting conversation. And the other thing that they said that really kind of got me thinking, you know, speaking broadly, I'm not going to say they were talking to a faculty audience. They were talking about employees in general. And our students, by the way, they're very concerned. Surveys are showing very concerned about what this means for their future jobs and their future professions. Here's what the panelists said. They said, what did they say? You're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to people who know how to use AI. And that was another sort of tipping point for me, like, okay, we have an opportunity to empower our students to learn how to use these tools well. But before we go any further on that, and we are going to come to some ideas and some examples, I do think it's important to recognize that, like I said, it's easier to cheat now. And every day I'm talking with different professors, different students who have stories about what, you know, where they have seen examples. Here's one. I was talking with a friend of mine who teaches large enrollment anthropology class. And this was last spring. And many of us then, I honestly don't think it's really possible. I think we've come to that conclusion. But back then, way back long ago in spring, we were trying to figure out how we could assign things that would not be possible to do with ChatGPT, that would force students to do. And one of the recommendations was to ask students to write about their own personal experiences or things that ChatGPT couldn't know anything about. So my anthropology friend, she invited her large enrollment class to write a short reflection on their own identities and how those identities impact the way that they interact with people in society. Well, I kid you not, she read one of the submissions and it said, since I'm an AI, I don't have any identities and I don't really interact with people in society. And we're like, what? The student just submitted that? And yeah, because clearly I suspect that student didn't think that in that large enrollment class, the professor was really going to be reading all those entries. So it's easier to cheat. Cheating has been around, it's been on the rise, but this makes it easier. So let's acknowledge a few things about what we know about cheating from a robust body of literature. There's 30 years of really in-depth research that is available to us so that we can learn what leads people to cheat. And the first point I want to make is that cheating is not anything new, actually. We've always been doing this. We always, as a species, we have found ways to save time and effort, especially when the task in front of us is difficult, tedious, time-consuming, perhaps meaningless. This is what we do. This is how we innovate. And if we try to adopt this mindset of using ChatGPT as a way to save time and effort for ourselves, then it may help us to get past the blame game with students. There's a number of scholars who make the case that cheating, when students cheat, it's not actually a moral failure about their entire character. Now, bear with me for a minute, because you might be going, yeah, it is. But the point that these scholars make is that every human being can find themselves in circumstances where it is tempting to cut corners to some extent or other. We all experience this temptation, this circumstance. Maybe we're out of time, maybe we're short on resources, whatever it is. It's not hard to put ourselves into a situation where we ourselves have been like, maybe nobody will notice if I kind of do less than a thorough job on this particular report, as one example. So it's not about blaming students and criminalizing their behavior. It's more about helping them choose the right path. And so we're just going to touch on this idea of helping students work with integrity, and then we're going to turn our attention to some really practical ideas. So we know that students, and actually people, this applies across the board, we are more tempted to cheat or to cut corners when a few different conditions exist. When we see low value in the task ahead of us. You can think about this, for example, if you're on a committee and you don't really see the value of that committee, it can be really easy not to give the time and effort warranted to that committee work. So if you're not invested in the purpose or the value of the task, it makes it easier to cut corners. The same for our students. As we think about what we're asking them to do in our classes, if we can help them to see the value, if we can keep the idea forefront, that this has to be something that benefits students, that is valuable, it will help them to choose to do that work with integrity. It can also happen when students don't care about the material. And this is going to come back to the point I made earlier about how our emotions impact our motivation. If I don't value the task and I don't see the relevance of what I'm learning, I'm not going to be that interested in writing, a 3-page paper or whatever that might be. I'm just going to look for shortcuts. I think that is a common and fair thing that we can say. So a key strategy here to help people choose to do that work with integrity is to help our students care about what they're learning, because a leading finding from recent affective neuroscience, emotion science is what that is that we can only think deeply, we broadly as human beings, can only think deeply about what we care about. Whoa, that's pretty interesting. That's fascinating. We can only think meaningfully. We can only learn meaningfully when we care about the material. So it's really important to be very transparent to help our students care about what they're learning. Now, we often teach classes where the students don't see that relevance. I had a conversation last month with an art history professor. At her university, it happens that there's a large percentage of pre-med students. And she said her students ask her all the time, why do I have to take art history? I want to be a doctor. And so she explains to them that when you are a physician, you need to be able to look at the symptoms that are being presented before you, whether they're physical symptoms that you can examine visibly or whether they're psychological or internal things that you need scanned. You have to be able to critically appraise what is presenting, what the patient is presenting. Think critically about that and maybe even communicate what these symptoms are if you need to consult with a colleague. And these are the skills that you develop in an art history class, the ability to look carefully, critically analyze, communicate what you're seeing, apply those principles and ideas to other contexts. So this is the kind of thing that I mean when we help our students care about what they're learning and see the value of what they're learning. It helps them to choose to do the work. Now, is it going to solve every problem? No, because these are not any easy answers, but they're guiding principles that can help us help our students do their work the right way. We also know that students are more tempted to cheat when the stakes are too high, when there is too much pressure. If your class features 3 major exams and I bomb the first one, well, I'm going to feel like it's game over. So what that means is it increases the pressure on me to do really well on that first exam. And if I am not feeling prepared, if I'm not feeling if I have a large degree of anxiety, which we know test anxiety is a real thing, then it may lead me to look for ways to help myself out a little bit. So as we think about helping students do their work, despite the relative ease of turning to different tools that can help us cheat, which by the way, this has been going on. It's not like ChatGPT was the beginning of cheating. We know that contract papers, all kinds of, like Chegg.com, we know that this is and has been a problem. But as we think about our course design and our grading schemes, finding ways to relieve the pressure, maybe we have 8 unit tests instead of 3 major exams. Maybe we have a weekly quiz and students can drop their lowest quiz score. the idea of thinking about how we're assessing students and what different activities are worth in terms of the overall grade, that can help students choose to do that work with integrity as well. And this one, I think, is really the most interesting to me when we think about students get more tempted to cheat when they perceive that their instructor doesn't care about them as a person, that their instructor is not paying attention to them, that they view them as a person, I'm sorry, not as a person, but as a number. And this comes back to my point at the very beginning that when we invite connections with our students by showing who we are as a person, it actually opens the dialogue, it opens the door for us to demonstrate that we do care about our students as people and we support their learning. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am not saying that we should be our students' best friends, therapists, counselors, nothing along that line. We don't transgress professional boundaries, but we can communicate to our students that we care about them. And one of the ways that we can do that is to design activities and assignments that enable them to practice using generative AI so that they can be empowered and equipped. Now, I have just gone through lots and lots of talking points, and in a few minutes, or not even in a few minutes, in a moment, I would like to turn to some early steps if you're not doing these things yet, and then turn to some examples. But before I do that, I'm going to take a little break and check in with all of you. Once again, I haven't necessarily been looking at the chat box, but let me ask you now, what are some thoughts, and we'll do this via the chat just in the interest of time. What are some thoughts, reactions in the moment that you're having? If you would like to post a word or a few words in the chat box, what has gotten your attention? What have you found most intriguing so far? I'd love to kind of check in and see what's on your mind before we jump back in. It's helpful to know that confirming, I like your wording there, Beth, because the chat comment says confirming the reasons that students cheat or take shortcuts. And I think these are things that you probably already knew or suspected, right? And I do believe that much of what we're talking about today will help you feel affirmed, knowing that's what the research says. That we all cheat. Key skills that we need to teach students are critical thinking and communication. That's going to apply in every job of the future, right? That's a lot of concern students have right now is what even are the jobs of tomorrow? How is this going to affect me? And what we know is that ChatGPT and AI cannot think critically currently like humans can. We need to apply our own intelligence and the communication skills as well. About the possibilities, not sure where to start. The human connection is important and glad I mentioned it. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about where to start here next. So stay tuned. Yes, lots of what we already do in creating relationships. And here's my point. I think it's gratifying and validating to know that when we do make that effort to have relationships, appropriate relationships with our students, that it's going to help them engage and be more motivated to do that work. Early internet and Google days and smartphone days. I do think that you have a good point here as well, that AI will inherently most things we ask students to know. I would say yes and no. I think that undervaluing these things it forces us to pause and think about what are we asking our students to know and do. And I believe we just went through this experience with COVID-19 and the move to emergency remote teaching. It forced us to take a critical look at teaching decisions and practices that we have been relying on for years. We're at another point like that. Maybe there are different things we should be asking students to do. And it's a challenging point to be at, but if we can take this opportunity to critically reflect, and I say we individually, but also higher education more broadly, when we ask students to do things that ChatGPT can easily do, maybe we need to take that moment to reimagine, which is a word I don't love, to be honest, but really think deeply about what we're asking people to do. Think about Google. A lot of students think that they don't have to memorize facts because they can always Google everything. Well, the counter argument there is that in order to engage in critical thinking and problem solving and analysis of case studies, you do actually need some foundational information, like, for example, knowing your multiplication tables helps you to engage in more complex mathematical equations more effectively because you have the automaticity. So yes, it is changing. It's going to change. ChatGPT and such will change what we're doing. but I don't think all is lost. Those headlines early in the I was going to say the pandemic. Maybe I mean like the GenAI pandemic or something like that. There was a lot of headlines about where this was going to take higher ed. Well, I think we can step up to the challenge, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I see a little bit more commenting here. Some how we use AI to our benefit, how we expect students to not use AI. That's a really important point. Just yesterday, I had, not yesterday, it was Tuesday, I was speaking with an education professor, and I love what she shared with me that she says to her students, and that is, hey, you future K-12 teachers, I'm very open to the use of ChatGPT in this class, but we have to kind of figure it out together, right? I don't know yet, but we are seeing that K-12 educators are using ChatGPT, for example, to create lesson plans. This particular prof said to me on Tuesday, people are using it, teachers are using it to help them craft professional and polite emails to parents about Sammy's bad behavior in class, as an example. So this professor was talking to the students about, let's figure this out together. And if you find ways that it's effective, let me know so we can all learn together, right? And then I do like one last thing that she added, which is to say, I'm very open to this, but I have to know how you are using ChatGPT. You have to cite it. You have to point out where you use ChatGPT, what step of the process did you use it to help you generate ideas. So I really like that approach as well. Wow, Oregon State. Sorry, Ian, I just see your comment here. I love the work that Oregon State does. They have so many great resources. So if you haven't seen this yet, a revised Bloom's taxonomy with things that AI can do and only humans can do. I'm literally going to grab that link right now. Thank you, Ian. This is why I love all of these conversations, because I'm always learning too. A great webinar through Quality Matters. Good to know. Awesome. Like so many resources, right? So I'm going to come back into the presentation to make sure we don't run out of time, but this is really helpful for all of us to be sharing ideas. I apologize if I didn't verbalize the comment that you have there, but we will share a little bit of time at the end for more. And I see Diana's comment. Again, I'm going to jump back in. I agree with that point. I heard an opposing point from an undergraduate literally yesterday, but we'll talk about that as time permits. So in my experience in different audiences and faculty groups that I have been working with, I do see a lot of range of experience and willingness. I still see, and it's not a still see, I am seeing, and this is valid, a lot of concern, fear, and anxiety. And what I was in a co-presentation yesterday, and my co-presenter cited a survey that showed that of people who are older, like for example, not older, but Gen X or in the baby boomer generation, that like we are not using it at all, and that's me. I'm in that category. And people who are in their more current Gen Z and younger generations are beginning to use these tools all the time. So it's not blame or shame, it's just recognition that many of us haven't yet dipped our toe into the water. And I would argue that we should, and I'll share some examples, things that if we haven't already done these things, let's start here. And then we're going to progress to some ideas and examples, whether you're already at a more experienced level or whether you're motivated to get to a more experienced level. That's where we're going to end up today, is a range of examples that are simpler to more complicated based on your interest, your level of motivation to engage in this work. But here's a few ideas. If you haven't been doing much yet, that's okay. Here's where we're at. And that is to start playing with generative AI tools. I saw this recommendation again early in the summer, like May or so. A colleague of mine had a piece in Inside Higher Ed, and he's like, you know what? These tools are still developing, and we are still developing our knowledge about how to use these well. But in the meantime, start playing with them. Because how can we use these tools effectively in our classes if we don't know what they're doing? So I took that to heart, and I developed a strategy where I would earlier in the summer, and I do this hit and miss now. If there's something that I was going to Google, like let me just look up online, because we do that all day, every day, I would go to a generative AI chatbot instead and ask that question. Now, there are different tools. I'm not going to get into the tech right now. Different responses will come from different tools, but I developed an affinity for Google Bard. If you haven't yet come across Google Bard, I find it friendly and easy to use. Some people will tell you it's not the most advanced, but the author of this article was saying, actually, yeah, you should be asking the same question to different chatbots that are available and then kind of compare what kinds of responses you get. So I was starting to practice this, and I came across an announcement for a webinar on teaching people who are from FGWC backgrounds. This was my example. I was like, well, what is this webinar and who are people from FGWC? It didn't actually spell it out. So normally I would Google that, right? But this time I was like, okay, Google Bard, what is that? And Google Bard in a minute came up, less than a minute, came up with this really great explanation about how FGWC stands for Fighters for Windmills and Garden Centers. These fighters for windmills and garden centers are doing such good work, and we really need to support their efforts. And I was like, wait a minute. I don't think that's actually what this webinar is about. Fighters for garden windmills and garden centers. If you notice, the acronym isn't even in the correct order. So that caused me to pause, right? That I had to take that critical lens to thinking about the output as opposed to submitting in my anthropology class, since I'm an AI. I had to take that critical moment. I did go ahead and Google it after Google Bard failed me. Turns out it stands for people who are from first generation or working class backgrounds. And that makes a lot more sense to me in the context of a webinar related to effective teaching. So when we start playing with it, we're going to find places that we can develop our own skill and awareness. Shortly after that, I used maybe even ChatGPT to summarize a scholarly article that I needed to know what was in there, and I was short on time. By the way, I do think that's a valid use. I don't think it's unethical. And it gave me some output that I was like, I'm not actually sure that that is what that article is saying. So that actually drove me into the article to take a little more time and take a careful look for myself. So I do believe that playing with it ourselves in personal and professional contexts can help us figure out what these tools are and what they are not. And then I would argue that as a general recommendation, and I have 3 questions related to this tip, that if we haven't yet been doing so, we need to be transparent with our students. I have a college student myself. I talk with undergraduates a lot. And it seems to me that many of us are not really acknowledging the elephant bot in the room yet. No blame, no shame. We're getting there. We are figuring this out. But I would encourage us to be very transparent with our students, like that education professor I was talking about. Let's figure it out together. So 3 quick questions before we move on to some examples. If you don't already have a syllabus statement, what might you use? And by the way, ChatGPT can help you create one. There are repositories of effective examples of syllabus statements. I think literally, because we know that ChatGPT doesn't necessarily, it's not like a search. It produces words that are associated with each other. So we do still need to do online searches. And if you were to look for examples, you could come up with some great ideas and inspiration. And if you don't have this yet, I think this is a great time to bring it to your students and to say, hey, let's work on this together. I think it's important that we acknowledge this. What are our expectations for how we could use GenAI in this class and how we are not going to? What is not acceptable? What is not appropriate? And then get students to help you craft that or comment or give feedback in a Google Doc or an anonymous survey or whatever that might be. Get the student voice, because that's going to weigh in on their motivation. It's going to help them choose to do that work effectively. And finally, again, if you haven't yet, maybe you're already doing this, but based on my experience, maybe you're not. We do need to be talking with our students. Again, that example from that education professor, I think, provides one way that we can do that. Hey, we need to figure this out together. It requires that we be transparent about our own knowledge or experience level or confidence, but talking with our students about these things, because it's going to prepare them to be successful in their future pursuits, academically, career-wise, and I would argue as engaged citizens as well. So I have seen some more activity in the chat box, but I'm going to resist the temptation to look. We're going to move into some examples ranging from simpler to more complex. Hopefully you get ideas. There are a range of different kind of disciplines represented here. Hopefully you get some ideas that apply to you. And I do want to save time at the end for comments and questions. Given the size of the group, I still recommend that we stay in the chat box, but maybe, and Gary, you and I can kind of figure this out when we get to that point. Maybe if somebody has a burning question that they would like to voice, we can see. I just generally find that if it's larger than, say, 30 people, it's easier to keep things contained in the chat box. But anyway, with that, as we look at some examples of what we can do, ways we can bring in AI into our classes, I want to direct you to a couple of the leading thinkers that I've been paying attention to in the last few months. Ethan Mollick, I would say, is like the leading higher ed scholar, researcher, and practitioner thinking about artificial intelligence in teaching and learning in higher education specifically. And here again, I don't necessarily have a link. Maybe somebody here can multitask. He's got two really wonderful resources. One is a Substack, a blog called One Useful Thing. He's been already publishing papers, and they're linked from his blog. Yes, and there's his profile. Thank you, Carl. The other thing that I would refer you to is a series of 5 videos that he has put out on YouTube through the Wharton School. Thank you, Ian. There's a series of 5 videos. They're about 10 minutes long and each, I should say, and they're about teaching and learning with AI. It's super practical. Now, here's the thing: is he recommends, that we do embrace AI. And I will say that not everything that he is saying I necessarily agree with. And he probably would say the same thing about me. That's how academia is. But some really, really practical ideas about what we can and should be doing with artificial intelligence. And I also like the work of Dr. Jason Gulia. He's at Berkeley College as an English professor. So there you are, right? Thinking about writing and composition. He reminds us that artificial intelligence is a tool. The tool can be used really well, or it can be used for nefarious purposes, as many students might be experimenting with right now. So for me, I have come to conclude that it is our responsibility, it is our opportunity to educate students on using this tool in an ethical way, in a responsible way, in an appropriate way, by bringing it into class assignments and talking about what we shouldn't be doing with these tools. Does that mean that no student is going to cheat? No, that's the no easy answer part. But we are going to help our students make those choices by thinking about activities and assignments where they see the value, the relevance, where they are going to experience greater motivation to do that work because they care about what they're doing, what they're learning, where they might even find it so interesting that they are going to be willing to, whether it's with AI or not, do that work in a meaningful way. So a few, again, ranges. Thank you, Ian, as well, for the link to the video. A few ranges of ideas that we can share. First of all, is to think about helping your students use this as a learning aid. And I talked with a psychology prof last spring who said that he says to his students, and last spring it was really early days compared to where we are right now. He said, don't cheat with this tool, but use it to help you understand different concepts. You can use it to help you understand these difficult, challenging things that we're talking about in this class. So some very practical things that you can ask your students to do, or maybe you might want to do some of these things as well as you're beginning to play with it. And that is to create additional examples. One of the things that ChatGPT is really good at is coming up with different examples, different analogies, different illustrations. And you can even say, explain this to me with 3 different examples written at a 5th grade reading level. I have done that on challenging concepts in neuroscience, and it has really helped me. So invite students to use these tools to create additional examples. It's also really good at creating all kinds of multiple choice quizzes. So whether you use this in your own teaching, whether you ask students to quiz themselves or get into a study group and have ChatGPT create 10 multiple choice questions on this particular topic or content, and then quiz each other, really powerful. It's one of the things that this tool does well. I like the idea of debating the chatbot, or just in general engaging in a conversation with the chatbot. You can ask ChatGPT to provide an argument on a particular stance on a controversial issue, and then you can engage in that conversation. I think that's what's really unique about these tools. Another kind of spin or twist on this would be to engage in a mock interview. Literally yesterday, that co-presentation I was mentioning, it was with career services here on campus. And we were talking with the career coaches about how to help students use ChatGPT effectively. Well, mock interview can be another really great way to help students refine their thinking. But as we mentioned earlier, it's very important to take a critical lens to what AI creates, whether it's fighters for windmills and garden centers, or whether it's, since I'm an AI, I don't have any identities. We need to coach students. We need to help them analyze what these things are putting out. And so one example, I was talking with a professor, a business prof recently, and she said, I used to have my students identify a business problem, do some research, and then write a paper that explains, based on the research, how they could solve that problem. She's like, ChatGPT can do that. So she was describing to me her new plan for this fall, and I haven't seen her since. This was right before fall started. that she was going to ask students to, yes, identify that problem, do some research, ask ChatGPT to generate the solution and write, some paragraphs or whatever it might be. And then look at what ChatGPT, and based on their knowledge and their learning, identify holes or flaws or places that are inaccurate or need strengthening. So flipping, as we were saying earlier, yes, it is going to change what we ask students to do. We need to flip and see how we can use the tool and help students practice that critical analysis, because that's going to be necessary no matter what. I also like the idea of thinking about how we can bring visuals more into our teaching and learning. This is, and if you haven't come across this resource, it's really powerful, 101 Creative Ideas to Use AI in Education. It's an open source resource, which means it's free. Lots of different examples from different disciplines and professors around the world. And this is the idea of expressing material in a different way. So how might we ask students to describe a concept using a visual? And tools such as DALL-E and other image generators that are out there, you can just type in some words and it will create that representation. This could be a really interesting way to ask students to represent the concept of, for example, the id or the ego or the superego in Freudian psychology, psychoanalysis. Thinking about getting students to approach something from a different angle can really be a helpful way to for them to internalize and gain that deeper understanding. And kind of at more of an even a surface level, I came across a web design instructor, again, late last spring, who said, typically the projects in his class, students have to code an HTML. They have to code HTML and create a basic web page. And that was kind of it. But now he said to his students, hey, why don't you add some visuals? Why don't you go and use these tools and add some banners or logos or visuals, representations of what you have on your website? And what that allows us to do is to start to remove those long-standing barriers. Previously in this web design class, he didn't expect his students to have that ability or knowledge, or it was outside the scope. We're not here talking about graphics, we're here talking about HTML coding. Well, now, because of some of the functionality that these tools have available, we can really sort of push the limits. And so I have two more examples that I just want to share with you before we finish with a few more minutes for questions and conversation. First of all, another example I came across with a history professor at a community college in Minnesota. He was talking to me about a class-wide activity that he led last spring. It took about 3 class meetings, and as a class together, and luckily a small enrollment class, they were able to ask ChatGPT to design a perfect government, and then they were able to push back on some aspects. Like, why did you do that? What about this consideration? Engage in that critical conversation, refine the prompts, right? We know that prompt engineering is a skill that students, and I would say that we need to be developing in order to sort of have a class discussion on concepts in the class based on what ChatGPT was coming up with. I love that idea. It's so practical, so interactive. And finally, again, Jason Gulia, who I introduced you to, he's been very active on LinkedIn. He teaches digital storytelling, and this idea of pushing the limits or extending beyond previously existing boundaries comes down to, in his digital storytelling class, people would have to describe, but now he's able to say, okay, go make a prototype of a video game because these tools will allow you to do those things. So thinking about ways that we can ask our students to do things that didn't used to be previously possible, that's where I go when I think about, do we have to start doing things differently? Are we turning things on their heads? Well, yeah, I really do think so. But hopefully we can begin to be creative and find that inspiration to make it exciting for students so that they do want to do their work, right? That's a key part of motivation, key part of helping them to do that work with integrity. So that's the end of what I have for you. I would invite you to share a key takeaway. We did a little bit of this earlier, but now with these other concepts that we've come across, key takeaway in the chat box and or any additional questions and conversation. And Gary, I will start by asking you, has anything come in since I was last reading the chat box that we should address?
Yeah, I think the only question I saw was that Anne, when you mentioned debating the chat bot, asked if that was only in English or in other languages.
Good question. My understanding is that English is the most advanced. I'm saying that kind of in a strange way, but the ChatGPT does best in English. I've been talking with some professors who teach different languages, foreign languages, and they're saying, yeah, it's not that good at those yet. But notice the key word of yet. Here's the other thing that, because these things are developing, the other thing that I would say, it's not exactly an answer to that question, but we know that ChatGPT can help and is helping non-native speakers of English to present a slightly more academic or standardized use of English. Now, here again, that's the pushback that I heard back in August, that we don't want to just standardize everything. But for many people, it allows their ideas to be expressed in a way that is acceptable in academia or in a professional workplace setting. So that can benefit non-native speakers, people with learning disabilities, these kinds of things. I do just see Elizabeth's comment here that we need to rethink not just how we teach, but what we're teaching and what we're asking students to do. I would agree. Keep playing with it. It can be a useful tool for education. I agree. I think here's the way I think about ChatGPT. It's like a power tool. Power tools are really powerful, but they can cause a lot of damage. And so I'm encouraging us to be open, to be curious, to proceed with caution, to develop our own fluency in order to see how they might benefit students. Further thoughts or questions at this time? Thank you for those of us who, not us, thank you for those of you who were providing links. Appreciate that.
As we're waiting for questions, I'll make sure that I send those links out to everybody after the session, along with a link to the recording.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I really do appreciate that we're all in this together. I see a comment from Glenna that how much we need to increase ethics in teaching across disciplines. We're in a new world. Whether or not we want to be in the new world, we are in the new world, and we have new considerations. I do believe that ethics kind of rise to the top here. Thank you, Thomas, for your kind comment. Yes, we absolutely need to continue sharing information and ideas for teaching. And I think the challenge there is that who has time? But that's what some of those people who are at the other end of the spectrum, the ones who are like, look at all the things you can do. Well, that's a lot of what they're saying is, how can we begin to save ourselves time? For example, we could use ChatGPT to generate a rubric for us. Now, here again, I would say it could save us a lot of time, especially if we're the kind of person who struggles to get started on something. It can generate a rubric like that. And then, of course, we need to go through and critically analyze that and see if that really resonates with us and our learning goals and the classes that we're teaching as well. You're welcome, Beth, for sharing some different resources. I'm still learning. We're all learning. I would say all of us are learning. And thank you, Linda Lee, for the kind comment. We're, like I said, I'm just bringing to you what my passions are, what my reality is, right? Like, I'm struggling to keep up with all this. We all are, but I do believe we have to attend to this. So thank you for the kind comments. Gary, anything else from you? Looks like people have a busy day, which I don't blame them.
Right. Yeah, we're getting close to 1 o'clock. We are going to continue these conversations. Our next workshop is coming up in November, but we also have our fall conference coming in October. So watch your email and social media for those announcements coming up.
And thank you again to those of you who are putting comments in the chat box. This is, your feedback is very helpful for me as well. So I'm glad to know if what we brought here today was valuable. Thank you all.
All right, if there are no other questions, that concludes our workshop for today. I want to thank Flower Darby for some wonderful information. And as I said, I'll make sure that I get the recording out, as well as some of those links that you shared. Bye, everybody. Thank you, Flower.
Thank you.